crimson harvest of the marsh. The tree stands in the marrow of the marsh, a skeletal giant weeping a harvest it never asked to bear. Its branches are heavy, not with leaves, but with the viscous, iron-scented memory of the ground it feeds upon. This is the southern Gothic nightmare made flesh and bark, where the Spanish mosses turn to liquid rubies, dripping slow and rhythmic into the black water below, a clock ticking away the centuries of silence. It is a landscape that breathes with a heavy, wet heat, thick enough to choke the living and preserve the dead. Here is the pastoral scene gone rancid, a literalization of the strange fruit that once swung in the humid breeze. The nooses wait like open mouths, hollow and hungry, suspended from a crown that has seen too much to ever be holy again. It is a grotesque beauty, the kind that catches in the back of the throat like graveyard dust, reminding us that the land does not forget. The soil is saturated with the salt of tears and the copper of life force, churning beneath the indifferent gaze of a moon that bleeds white light onto the rot. The wooden path leads toward this altar of sorrow, a bridge built of planks that groan with the weight of those who walked it and never walked back. In this thick, airless dark, the ghosts aren't merely in the trees, the ghosts are the trees. Every knot in the wood is an eye, and every drip of crimson is a syllable in a long, suppressed scream. It is a place where the history of the South is written in the language of the vein and the vine, tangled so tightly that one cannot tell where the nature ends and the cruelty begins. In this landscape of shadow and hanging rope, the only thing more powerful than the ending is the one who survives to speak it into the light. The tree remains, rooted in the gore of the past, but the narrative belongs to the witness who refuses to let the swamp swallow the truth whole. Roots of inequality. The live oak stands as a silent, gnarled sentinel, its limbs heavy with the gray-beard moss that tastes of salt and old grief. We look at the surface, at the silhouettes of men standing on the crust of a promise, but the soil is a lie. It hides the architecture of a ghost, a southern Gothic nightmare where the roots do not drink water, but a bitter, binary ink. Here, the shade of the tree is not a refuge, it is a shroud, woven from the same fibers that once made the rope and the whip, casting a long, jagged shadow over the digital horizon. Beneath the manicured grass of the academy and the humming hubs of progress, there is a glitch in the marrow of the earth. Segregation did not die, it simply learned a new language, translating the old laws of the sun and the dirt into the cold, jagged teeth of a motherboard. The red lines of the code in the soil are the red lines of the map, a digital redlining that ensures the fruit of the tree, knowledge, power, the very air of the future, remains just out of reach for those whose ancestors' sweat watered the grove. It is a grotesque circuitry where the electricity is fueled by the heavy silence of the excluded, creating a divide as deep as the Atlantic and as sharp as a fractured screen. To be educated in this light is to be granted a lantern that only illuminates the path for a few, while leaving the rest to stumble over the exposed wires of a rigged history. The inequality we see today is not an accident of the harvest, it is the design of the seed. This haunting duality reminds us that the cloud is forever tethered to the mud, and the mud is thick with the memory of chains. I am the end of the story, the landscape might whisper, a finality that claims the right to define every chapter that came before. The ledger of red mud. The earth here does not just hold the weight of the walking, it heaves with the memory of what was stolen. In this surreal thicket of moss and shadow, the trees hang like damp, weeping shrouds, their limbs twisted into the agonizing geometry of a history that refuses to stay buried. This is the Southern Gothic at its most visceral, a landscape where the very air is thick with the scent of forced departure and the iron-tasting mud of the Trail of Tears. The figures are silhouettes of a fading presence, pushed along a path carved not by necessity, but by a greed so profound it turned the soil itself into a witness. Look closely at the gouges flanking the path, those deep, jagged ditches that seem to bleed into the swamp. They are not merely drainage for the rain, they are reservoirs for a collective mourning, filled to the brim with the salt and stinging grief of a people unmoored. Every mile traveled was a ledger of loss, and in this art those trenches overflow with the tears of the removed, soaking into the roots of the cypress until the entire South became a monument to a crime that time has failed to dilute. It is a grotesque beauty, reminding us that the ground we claim was once a theater of sorrow. This displacement is not a ghost story relegated to the past. It is a living, breathing fracture in the foundation of the present. The forced removal depicted here mirrors the modern systemic erasures that continue to challenge indigenous sovereignty and land rights today. When a people are torn from the geography that defines their spirit, the wound remains open, manifesting in the ongoing struggle for legal recognition and the protection of sacred sites. We are still walking those shadowed paths, and the rights of indigenous Americans remain tethered to the reclamation of a narrative that was nearly whispered into extinction. This sentiment echoes through the mossy canopy, a defiant assertion of agency in a world that tried to render them invisible. To look upon this image is to confront the dark marrow of the American identity, to acknowledge that the beauty of the Southern landscape is inextricably bound to the grotesque injustice of its clearing. We must look into those tear-filled ditches and recognize that the story is far from over. It is still being written by those who survived the shadows. Hands of the unheard, the epidemic of the ridges. The mountains do not merely hold the mist, they secreted a gray-white dampness that smells of wet iron and old grievances. In this hollow, poverty is not a statistic or a lack of coin, it is an epidemic, a living rot that settles into the floorboards of the leaning shacks and the marrow of the men who dwell within them. The soil here has grown bitter, yielding only stones and the ghosts of wages that were never enough to buy a man's dignity back from the company store. Geographic isolation has turned the valley into a jar with the lid screwed tight, where the air is thick with the stagnant breath of 1,000 forgotten generations, and the silence is a heavy physical weight pressing down on the rusted tin roofs. Look at the hands, pallid, desperate things, rising from the fog like branches stripped to their fruit. They reach for a moon that remains a cold silver coin, forever out of currency for those who reside in the dirt. These are the prayers of Appalachia, physicalized and grotesque, clawing at a sky that has turned its back. They are the cries of the hollowed out, the ones whose labor has been harvested until there's nothing left but the ache. But the relief they seek is a ghost story told in a language no one outside these ridges cares to translate. The prayers are swallowed by the canopy, unheard by a world that views their suffering as a moral failing or a picturesque ruin, a hard-hearted stewardship that mistakes a lack of empathy for a devotion to tradition. There's a cruelty in the distance between the hand and the light, a gap bridged only by the indifference of those who sit in well-lit rooms and decree that the hungry should feast on their own resilience. Here, the wage disparity is a canyon so deep that the sun never hits the bottom. The people are told they are the backbone of the nation, even as that spine is snapped over the knee of progress and left to calcify in the dark. They are isolated not just by the jagged peaks of the earth, but by a curated apathy that treats their struggle as an inevitability of the landscape. The house remains dark, its porch a toothless grin in the moonlight, holding the secrets of 100 broken promises. It is a monument to the end of things, to the exhaustion of a people who have been reminded of their hope. They have been written out of the ledger of the living, left to haunt the very ground that betrayed them.